So basically, I want to talk about what rent control is. So if you see me looking down, I'm looking down at my notes so I can make sure that I talk about everything that I want to talk about. Because usually when I'm watching the video back, I'm looking like, dang, I should have said this, or I should have said that. But I don't think of it at the time. So what is a rent control department? So many major cities have rent control departments. And rent controlled apartments, basically, it's a price ceiling for what landlords can charge for rent, you know? So rent control basically prevents landlords from price gouging. And how rent control came about was, so after World War I, about in the 1920s, a lot of soldiers were coming home from war, especially they were coming to major cities like New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, like all major cities, but there was not that much housing. So there was a high demand for housing, but the supply was just not there. So anytime there's a high, demand for something and the supply is low, of course, that, whatever product or service that you're selling is going to be higher. So since there wasn't that much supply, landlords were like, oh, this was their time to capitalize and, make as much money, with the rental market that they could. So this is what landlords were doing. Investors and builders started building properties, left and right. Like it was like a big boom of just, building up major cities after World War I. But they were charging astronomical prices, for their apartments. So around the 1920s, 1921, like I said, this is when it all started. So as, years went by, so soon there were rent wars and rent strikes all over the country. You can Google it for yourself. Rent strikes after World War I, rent strikes, rent wars, okay? So do the due diligence, do your own due diligence and do that research for yourself, because I'm sure there's plenty of content on that on YouTube. I haven't personally looked for it, but I will after I finish recording this video. So basically World War I was the birth of rent controls. Now, a lot of cities don't do rent control anymore, but I know, I believe West New York and New Jersey does rent control. West New York is a town that sits right on the Hudson River, and I'm sure Jersey City does it. New York City doesn't do rent control anymore. They do have rent stabilized apartments, which is a little different. I'll talk about that at another time. But currently there is about 38,000 rent controlled apartments in New York City, and mostly people have been living in those apartments since the 70s, or if you live in a house that is rent controlled from like the 50s, I believe. Yeah, so people who live in those rent controlled apartments have been living in those apartments since basically the 70s. And back in the day, you could pass your apartment on down. So say for instance, I live in an apartment now, my daughter is 20, and I say, you know what, I'm gonna move, but you can have this apartment. Then it would be passed down to her. The thing is that you have to live in the apartment 2 years before it can be passed down to you, so you can inherit it. So if my grandma was living in my apartment currently and I came to stay with her and in 2 years passed and I'm like, hey, I basically would inherit the apartment. They would pass it down to me so she can go to a senior citizen home or 55 and older living, and then that apartment would be mine. But like I said, they don't do that anymore. The whole rent control apartments is like defunct in New York City. So basically, with rent controlled apartments, owners are allowed to increase their rent based on inflation or the rate in inflation plus a percentage, okay? Let me say that one more time because I had to read this about 2 times to understand it, okay? Owners are allowed to increase their rent based on inflation or the rate of inflation plus a percentage. So basically, that is just the cost of living. Each year there is a cost of living, and I believe cost of living is 3%. I'm sure it's 3%. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I feel like rent control is something that's good because I know last November I did like a temp position at an apartment community in Harlem, New York, and a new owner bought out a bunch of properties, and when they bought those properties out, they increased the rent, like really increased it. And I remember working in the leasing office, and people were getting their lease renewals for the next year's rent, and their rent was like between $300 and $500 more. Like, I understand you could go up about $40, maybe $60, $30 to $60, okay, Okay, but from $300 to $500 increases, and people will be calling the office like, oh hell no. So the property manager was getting all these phone calls and all these emails all, you know, all day, and she like basically locked herself in the office so she could handle it. But it's just like, this is why you need some type of a rent stabilization, you know, because if not, like, it's like, okay, new owners are in, and now they drastically increase the rent. Now the people who can afford to live there can't live there anymore, so they have to move, and now you're getting a whole demographic of people moving in. I mean, maybe that's the point, you know what I'm saying? Like, get rid of the old, bring in a new hipster, you know, young, you know, gentrify the neighborhood, you know what I'm saying? So that prevented things like that. So if you were wondering what rent control was, because I know my coworker asked me like, what is rent control? Like, she had never heard of it before. That is what rent control is. And like I said in previous videos, my brokers are property owners, and I see, you know, from their rent rolls that there are people that live in their properties that pay like $300. Somebody was paying like $178. Somebody else was paying like $700. Somebody else was paying like $1,900. So those people who were living in an apartment since like probably like the 70s are probably the ones paying $178. And I'm gonna tell you this right now, if you live in a rent controlled apartment, your apartment is going to look like the 60s. It's going to look like the 70s. It's not going to be cute and updated. It's going to be mad old. Mad old. My boy lived in a rent controlled apartment up in Queens. What part of Queens did he live in? Was it Flushing? I'm not even sure. That ain't even got nothing to do with what I'm saying right now. But he was saying that that apartment had been in the family for years. And when I tell you, this apartment was huge. It was spacious. Not these little tiny apartments that these developers are building now, but it was mad old. Like, I could tell, like, that apartment been in the family since like the damn 70s, the early 70s at that. So if you are looking to buy a property, if you go on the MLS, which is the multiple listing services for real estate agents, they will list like multifamily houses and like dwellings, buildings, tenements, however you want to call it. And if there are tenants living in there, on the MLS, it will tell you how much each person pays, so that you're not blindsided, so that you don't buy a property, you know, and not know that some of the apartments are rent controlled. You will know right up front, okay, somebody is paying $300 up in here, okay?